Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat. Resolves.
Right.
Now, before you attack
Does
me-
anyone have an answer?
Well played.
Good game.
Hello everyone, my name is DJ and today we have something super special. I'm going to talk about a brand new Commander pre-constructed deck from Commander Legends 2 Battle for Baldur's Gate. I'm talking about the Flayarrrs deck. That's right, it's featuring a horror pirate. Before we get started, I want to thank Wizards of the Coast for this special free preview opportunity. Thank you, Wizards. I also want to thank my special guest, Gavin Verhey. He is the lead designer for this entire Commander set, and he's going to be talking to me about a few cards in here. I also want to thank the sponsor of the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel, Cool Stuff Inc. If you want to pick up some cards, make sure you use the coupon code JUMBO5 to save 5% off your order. Now, let's jump into the face commander of this Mind Flayers deck. It's Captain Negathrod. Captain Negathrod is 3 blue-black for a 3/6 legendary horror pirate. Horrors you control have menace. Whenever a horror you control deals combat damage to a player, that player mills that many cards. At the beginning of your end step, choose target artifact or creature card in an opponent's graveyard that was put there from their library this turn. Put it onto the battlefield under your control. We can see from this commander right away that this is going to be a horror tribal deck. That's so cool and so on flavor for the Dungeons and Dragons Battle for Baldur's Gate sort of theme behind it. Let's go ahead and check in with Gavin and find out what inspiration he had for putting together Captain Negathrod.
Yeah, awesome graphic coming to you right here. I'm Gavin Verhey, everybody. I'm a principal game designer at Wizards of the Coast, which means I design these delightful cardboard squares that we all love playing with. And I was the lead designer for the Battle for Baldur's Gate commander decks. One thing we like to do with our Creature Type Matters commanders is enhance the creatures. And Menace made a lot of sense for a couple of reasons. First of all, horrors are scary, so there's that. It just fits really well flavorfully. 2, a lot of them want to get through. And then the last ability, this one went through a lot of iteration. And it's because we were like, okay, you're going to mill them, but we know that we don't want you milling your opponent out. We want you to gain value out of milling them a little bit. And what ways could you do that? And we tried a few different things, but ultimately settled on taking from their graveyard, which one really felt like a horror thing to do, take your opponent's stuff. One of the big challenges with this deck is Mind Flayers are all about taking your opponent's stuff, but stealing your opponent's creatures and permanents all the time is really unfun. So how do you mitigate that? Well, if you take out of their graveyard, that's not a feel bad of taking their thing on the table. You're not stealing their commander or making them discard cards. You're just using a card they weren't using anyway, but you get that Mind Flayer flavor of getting their stuff, which is really, really fantastic. And it pairs so well with that second ability. I also love that we wrote it in a way where it could be milled from anywhere. So you can also just play Captain Negathrod in your mill deck. If you just want to play like Captain Negathrod and then Mind Sculpt them or something like that, totally on the table. You can just do that too. And take the best card out of the graveyard, the best artifact or creature out of the graveyard.
So this deck is going to be filled with horrors and horrors that want to attack, but this isn't an aggressive deck, although Gavin's told me about some really aggressive starts where you get your commander out fast and steal something huge. The way that this deck mostly plays out is through a slow controlling strategy. That's pretty interesting for a deck that wants to attack and wants to utilize your opponent's graveyard. But Captain Negathrod is not your only option for leading this commander deck. We actually have a partner pairing. We have Zelix Sanity Flayer, and that can be paired with a background. Let's talk about Zelix first. Zelix Sanity Flayer is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 legendary creature horror. It has Hive Mind. Whenever a player mills 1 or more creature cards, you create a 1/1 black horror creature token. 1 tap, target player mills 3 cards. Choose a background. Now, there are backgrounds in the main Commander Legend sets and backgrounds in the other Commander decks, but there's one specific one included in this deck, and it's particularly good when you have a lot of horrors on the battlefield. Haunted One is 2 and a black for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have whenever this creature becomes tapped, it and other creatures you control that share a creature type with it get +2/+0 and gain Undying until end of turn. So we can see that this pair is going to be sort of a go-wide strategy because all those 1/1 horrors become pumped up by 2.
So we knew really early in design, literally in the first couple weeks, that we wanted to do the choose a background thing with these commander decks. The main set was going to have a bunch of backgrounds and commanders with choose a background. And we thought, well, for our backup commanders, for the secondary commander in every deck, it would be really fun if we also did a background and we did choose a background character for it. For a couple of reasons. One, it just ties in the main set's themes, which is really cool. But also, the main set is tied to the mechanics that it has access to in that set. It can't pull mechanics from all around Magic history like these commander decks can. So what if we use these to kind of make some really big commander-sized ones and occasionally dig into mechanics that the main set doesn't have access to? And you'll see that in this partner pairing. So let's talk about Zelix first. So Zelix is this character who, Captain Negathrod is all about playing the mill strategy, right? Or not all about it, but definitely wants you to be milling your opponent over and over again so you can get its good stuff out of the graveyard. Zelix wants you to do something very different, which is you're going to build up a horror army, right? Negathrod is just taking their best thing every turn. You might kill them with their own stuff. Zelix is, I'm going to get a bunch of horrors in play, and then I can beat you down to death by enhancing all of my creatures and killing you. Negathrod is more of the control commander. As I mentioned earlier, this deck can play in a few different ways. It's often controlling, but if you play the Zelix commander out of the box, you'll be playing a little more of an aggressive strategy because you're going to get all these tokens that will become larger. Now, how are we going to make them larger? There's 1/1 tokens. What are you doing with that? Well, that is where Haunted One comes in, the background that pairs with it, which whenever your commander becomes tapped, gives all your creatures +2/+0 and Undying until end of turn. This lets all those tokens hit really hard. They smash in for 3 points apiece and pumps up all your other horrors, which is really nice. And a big thing about any kind of creature-focused deck is resiliency, right? When you get Wrath after building out your entire army, well, that sucks. Your stuff doesn't come back. Now, Undying, of course, won't bring back those tokens. The tokens will die. But all of your horrors will come back into play. So Zelix will stay alive. All of the character cards you put out that you built up will stay alive. A number of horrors have enters the battlefield triggers too. Like you look at a card like Dark Hatchling, which will kill off your opponent's creature. So there's some good synergies there. Also, big thing you'll note here is that Haunted One says whenever your commander becomes tapped, not when it attacks, when it becomes tapped. So because Zelix has a tap ability on him, sure, you can do it on your turn if you want. You can tap it and give all your stuff +2/+0 for the combat phase. Or if you want to wait until an opponent's turn, you can actually leave it up to give your stuff Undying to prevent it from getting Wrath, which is a pretty big deal. And once again, they'll only clear away those tokens. All your other horrors will undie back to the battlefield. So I think these cards are pretty cool. One thing I love about the backgrounds too is we wanted to make sure that you could mix and match them across different decks you could build. So Haunted One, great in this horror tribal deck for sure. Also, if you want to go build a different deck that cares about creature types, go nuts, right? You can go put this in your zombies deck if you want to, for example. And it's a card I could see you even playing without a choose a background commander. You just slot that into your zombies or elves deck or something, and hey, your commander comes tapped, all your stuff gets bigger and Undying. Lots of great stuff you can do there. Not least of which is attack and then cast a Wrath post-combat, killing all of your stuff. It comes back and killing all of your opponent's stuff too. So that's kind of how those two cards came to be. Haunted One went through a ton of revisions. We tried a lot of different things here, but Undying was just a really cool word that fit well with the horror flavor, and once again, a mechanic we couldn't do in the main set.
All right, one of my favorite cards from this set is Aboleth Spawn. 2 and a blue for a 2/3 fish horror. It's got flash and ward too. Probing Telepathy. Whenever a creature entering the battlefield under an opponent's control causes a triggered ability of that creature to trigger, you may copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. Oh my gosh, Aboleth Spawn is great. This is like the best part of Fairy Artisans that creates that token that goes away. You always seem to get those extra ETBs from all of your opponent's creatures. And Aboleth Spawn is great.
Copying them is really interesting because I love cards that are a little dual-sided, right? In that you can play this card and you'll be like, hey, don't play your triggered abilities because I'm going to copy them. And maybe someone will play into it anyway and give you something. And when that happens, you get to play a little bit of politics, right? They're like, hey, I'm going to play my Ravenous Chupacabra or whatever card they have for some different triggered ability card. And it's like, I'm not going to kill your thing. If you would kill someone else's thing, though, that'd be great, right? Like, okay, let's team up and do this a little bit. And it's pretty fun to be able to copy their triggered abilities. We haven't really seen a card like this before. And I think it lends itself well to the kind of inscrutable nature of horrors. In Commander, of course, lots of abilities to trigger on your opponent's side, lot that are ETB abilities, and you'll happily copy them all for the most part. So I think this is going to be a pretty fun card, and I can't wait to see it in play.
Absolutely. And also it says you may copy that ability. So if there's any sort of shenanigans around there. exactly.
Right, you can't be with Phage. You're like, we did think about that, right? We're like, well, hey, if you don't want to copy the ability, you don't have to.
Next up, we have Grell Philosopher, 2 and a blue for a 1/4 horror wizard with aberrant tinkering. When Grell Philosopher enters the battlefield and at the beginning of your upkeep, each horror you control gains all activated abilities of target artifact and opponent controls until end of turn. You may spend blue mana as though it were mana of any color to activate those abilities. Oh my, this can just turn all your horrors into mana rocks, or I can only imagine the types of cool things, cool artifacts your opponents could have for me to take advantage of.
So this card is, I think, one that is easy to sleep on. This is one that, by the way, you do not need other horrors to make good. This card is like great on its own, I think, because there's so many artifacts that are thrown around in Commander games. And at the very least, like, there's a good chance someone's gonna have like their Soul Ring or their Thran Dynamo or something in play, and suddenly all your horrors are gonna tap for 2 or 3 mana. In fact, if you look at the artwork here, you'll notice he's holding a ring. There's a ring in the artwork. That's a little nod.
Nice.
Just a Soul Ring there, right? So there's a lot of artifacts you can take advantage of with this, and your control deck. So you want to ramp out your big threats early. You play this on turn 3, you'll start ramping into your bigger creatures and get all the mana you need to use. This card also, I talked about mana abilities, sure, but there's a lot of non-mana ability artifacts too that are out there that you get to steal. I'll tell you one thing for sure: if your opponent has this card, never cast your Staff of Domination. They will probably do something ridiculous and you will lose.
All right, next let's talk about Psionic Ritual. 4 blue for a sorcery. It has Replicate. Tap an untapped horror you control. Exile target instant or sorcery card from a graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Exile Psionic Ritual. At its baseline, this could just flashback something. Very cool, totally worth it. But in a horror deck, the idea that this can hit 3 or 4 or 5 different spells, depending upon how wide your board is. And remember, you're milling your opponent this entire time, so you're gonna have access to some really great spells. Gavin described a scenario where this could just be kind of a board wipe. He used it as just a 6 mana board wipe. You got a board wipe over there? Great, let's reset the game. I'm the control deck. But also you can just cast it for value. He described other situations where it's like, okay, I'm going to ramp, draw a few cards, kill that artifact. Great, that's all, I'm good. Go pass the turn. And that idea of just picking and selecting some normal cards in commander decks is also great. But remember that there are some crazy instant and sorcery spells that commander players play.
So a few things going on here. First of all, it's the first ever, I believe, non-mana replicate cost. So that's really exciting. You can, you can have some pretty big turns with this. It's a card you could just play on its own for 6 mana. Maybe you've got a couple of horrors in your deck you can use it with every now and then. Your commander's a horror or something. But of course, if you have a bunch of horrors, it's going to do awesome stuff.
You introduced a huge horror with a Brain Stealer Dragon.
Yeah.
5 black, 6/6 dragon horror with flying. At the beginning of your end step, exile the top card of each opponent's library. You may play those cards as long as they remain exiled. If you cast a spell this way, you may spend mana as though it were a mana of any color to cast it. Whenever a non-land permanent an opponent owns enters the battlefield under your control, they lose life equal to its mana value. So big, over-the-top horror. Love that it's a dragon. The art on this is phenomenal. Like dragon with like face tentacles coming out. Spectacular. And I love that not only does it steal stuff, but it turns their spells that you get into like added fireballs. It's amazing.
Yeah, so this one is a blast. You want to talk about how this card came to be. I was like, okay, this is a control deck. One thing that these decks always need is a way to win games, right? They got to close out. You got to have some big hitters, and we should make a new big creature. And in my head, I was like, what the coolest thing I can think of is a dragon who's a horror. Like, you think of just creatively, you're like, is there a Mind Flayer dragon out there? And I did a bit of looking around, and I couldn't really find one. So I turned to Mike Merles, and I was like, hey, Mike, I'm trying to find, is there ever been a Mind Flayer dragon in D&D? And without missing a beat, he's like, oh yeah, he's like, oh yeah, in a magazine many years ago, there was an article that mentioned, that gave rules for like this Brain Stealer dragon. And I was like, can we use that? And he's like, sure. So that's how that got in there. It's a monster you will not really find in a monster manual anywhere, but does exist in the D&D canon. And I love those kind of like deep cuts, right? So some fans might, it's a really we call it lenticular design, because if you never heard of this thing from Dragon Magazine, whatever issue it was in a bajillion years ago, you're just like, Mind Flayer Dragon, duh, that sounds awesome, sign me up.
Yeah.
And if you do know the reference, you're like, wow, I can't believe they dug that deep, which is exactly the nostalgia I like to try and hit.
Brain Stealer Dragon is the reason why I play Commander. It is so big and over the top, but I love the other synergies. Working with your Commander, we mentioned, is really good, pulling those permanents out of your opponent's graveyards to trigger Brain Stealer Dragon. But I just like the idea of reanimating something, a reanimate then being a big fireball for your opponents, or even casting a bribery. You know, this is anything your opponent owns, like a desertion. There's so many different ways to steal things that your opponents have. And once you steal them, the idea that you're just bashing them in for damage with this huge dragon horror has me filled with joy. Next up, we have From the Catacombs. 3 black for a sorcery. Return target creature card from a graveyard to the battlefield with a corpse counter on it. If that creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. You take the initiative. This also has Escape for 3 black. Exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So this is a reanimation spell. You know, reanimation spells are best when they're the cheapest, so that you can get the biggest thing out the fastest. And with a 5 mana reanimation spell, well, some of the biggest things are only, 8, 9, 10 mana, so you're not cheating that much mana. And it's kind of hard to get up to 5 mana, so you're not cheating that much time. But what this lacks in sort of pushed numbers, it makes up for in the ability to do this over and over again, and also engage in this interesting dynamic called the initiative. First thing, let's talk about replayability, because being able to escape this over and over again and keep stealing things from your opponent's graveyard is great. It's just great. And in decks that can support self-mill and milling your opponents like this deck, this is going to be castable over and over again. So that's going to make up for a ton. And I have to also say that taking the initiative is spectacular. So the initiative is kind of like the Monarch. Once someone takes the initiative, you enter into a special dungeon and you've entered into it. But then when people deal combat damage to you, the initiative moves to them and they progress through the dungeon. So very similar to the Monarch. Now in this deck, we do have our horrors that like to attack and have menace. And so that's really great for retaking the initiative. But we are a little bit of a controlling deck, so we might not always have the ability to swing out to take back our card advantage. But if we have From the Catacombs, we don't have to swing out. We just have to cast this spell again. Cast this spell and get a blocker? Like, that play pattern is great, which has me thinking that From the Catacombs is going to be really solid in a lot of different decks, because you get this card advantage from getting the initiative, and you get the card advantage from the creature you've taken, and you get to play this over and over and over again. Endless Evil is up now. Endless Evil is 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura, enchant creature you control. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of enchanted creature, except the token is a 1/1. When enchanted creature dies, if that creature was a horror, return Endless Evil to its owner's hand. Hey, I want another 1/1 copy of all my best creatures every turn. This seems sweet.
Right, so a few things going on with this card that I think are pretty memorable. First of all, I love the name. I mean, my playtest name for it was Evil Never Dies, and Endless Evil is like maybe even better than that. It's just delightful. So I've always loved the card Followed Footsteps. So get that. That's a 5 mana enchantment where you get a copy of the card every turn. I think the card's really fun, weak, but pretty fun. And one thing that I wanted to try and do, whenever I make a deck that cares about creature types, one thing I try and do is make sure there are cards in there that are appealing to not just people who want to play that creature type, right? Because you look at a number of these cards, and you'll be like, well, if I'm not playing a horror deck, I'm not really in for this. And so one thing I try and do is come up with cards that you might just play regularly, but are better if you're playing with horrors. And one of the things I love about Endless Evil is you just put this in your deck. It's like a pretty sweet card. You can enchant a creature and get a 1/1 copy of it every turn. There's a lot of things I want to do that on. I want to make a 1/1 Muldrifter every turn. Are you kidding me? But if you're playing it in a horror deck, well, then you get to get it back and keep doing it over and over again. And I love that kind of bridges the gap of, hey, you don't have to play with your deck of all horrors. If you look through your commander deck and your deck has 6 horrors in it, if you're playing Ravenous Chupacabra and a few other cards, maybe you're like, I'll just play this because half the time it'll come back to my hand when it dies.
Let's talk about our last new card to spoil. It's Uchulan. 3 and a black for a star 4 Crab Ooze Horror. Uchulan's power is equal to the number of crabs, oozes, and/or horrors you control. It has Horrific Symbiosis. At the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target creature card from an opponent's graveyard. If you do, create a token that's a copy of Uchulan. This thing can go wide because it can keep feeding itself and make more and more copies. Not to mention all the support you have for horrors, much less crabs and oozes. Let's check in with Gavin because this is one of his favorite cards.
So one thing about this card is, going long, you want to be able to have threats, and you want kind of a card that can amass threats, and it gets to use all those cards that your opponent has milled over the course of the game. This card does exactly that. Early on, if you can get it going, awesome, great. It's a great attacker, and as you mill them with Captain Negathried, you can keep propagating it. But in the late game, it's literally a 1-creature army, because keep in mind, you're making tokens that are copies of it, and those tokens also have this ability. So the first turn, sure, you exile 1 thing and get 1 thing. The second turn splits and you get 2 things. The next turn, you get 4 things, right? So, and especially if they all have menace from the captain, it gets pretty hard to block these guys. I think our playtest record is 7 in play because 1 of them died. But yeah, if you get more than that, like, hats off to you.
So those are the new cards created for this, and a lot of the horrors, they feel thematic, but they do kind of different stuff. It feels like the dragon is over the top and even like breathing fire a little bit, the way dragons kind of do. And Uchulan feels, like it's in a dungeon, multiplying, and you have to navigate that scenario. It feels like all that stuff. So I love the feeling of this deck. And I think that you've honestly supplemented, all your reprints. I can feel the horror nature of all these creatures. And I gotta say, it's a fun creature type to play with, not only because, it's got, dungeon-y feel to it, but also because so many of them do different and kind of complicated things. It's not just like, enter the battlefield, draw a card, or I tap for mana. It's like, no, I'm gonna cause you to mill your hand. I'm gonna mill them. I'm gonna steal something. I'm gonna deal damage in this way. I'm gonna turn you into a sludge. It's all sorts of different things.
Well, I appreciate how much it really does feel like this inscrutable mix of horrors, right? You're playing the game and you're like, what weird abilities does this card have? You pick it up and you read it. And it kind of goes hand in hand with, one of my favorite things in Magic is when someone picks up your card because they just don't know what it does. And there's a number of cards in this deck which are quite strong. Your opponent will have to pick up and read what they do. For example, Dross Harvester is a card I don't think I've ever seen him play in a Commander game. And when we first started playtesting, I was like, is this card really going to make the cut? It looks really weak. But then we played it with it, and it's like, this card's actually really good. In this deck, right? Because first of all, you get all your horror tribal bonuses off of it, so it can't be blocked by the cap. It's got menace with the captain in play. But also, creatures are dying constantly. You're getting a ton of life off of this thing. As a card where it's a little wonky, but fits well here. Or Nihilith. Nihilith is a card I've always had a soft spot for since it showed up in Future Sight, but it works so well here. It ties in once again with that mill theme perfectly. You play it down, or for 2 mana, you suspend it, and then as they mill cards, it slowly comes out. And then once it's in play, it's got Fear, which is so hard to block. And there's a lot of cards like that, which I think are fun, charming finds for this deck, and not cards you would normally put into a Commander deck, but play really well with the horror stuff going on. And that's why I love these kind of decks so much.
Look, all of these new cards are exciting and flavorful, but it's still important to evaluate these decks in terms of reprints. That's to make sure that you want to buy them, and that you're getting good value for your money. One thing to note is that there are more reprints in these Commander decks than in Commander decks past. That's because there are only 10 brand new cards instead of 15. Wizards of the Coast said that a lot of the time the least popular 5 cards were, kind of dismissed, and everyone was focusing on the coolest cards of the new ones in a Commander pre-constructed deck. And the last 5 were ignored. And so they freed up 5 slots for reprints. Well, let's talk about the reprint value in this and see if those extra 5 slots made a difference. So there are lots of different numbers that we crunch from tons of different Commander releases. A lot of them are done by the Command Zone. Thanks over there. One thing that I've noticed is that if it's anywhere between $90 to $100 in reprint value, I'm feeling pretty good. There are some decks that are going over 100, and then that feels really good. And if there's ever a Commander deck with reprint value in the 70s to 80s range, then I'm feeling not so good on the value in that deck. So that's kind of the baseline that we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years. Now, what about this deck specifically? Well, at the time of recording, using the same metrics that we use for all of the other decks, this deck has a value of $133. Woo, this is a high price tag. Maybe this is where those reprints are coming into play because I love the reprints in this deck. There are 8 cards over $5, and there are 9 reprints between $2 and $5. And actually the deck is super well-rounded. There's a bunch of cards that just belong even though they are 50 cents or $1. If you want to check out the full deck list, there'll be a link down in the description that'll take you over to Wizards' website. The most expensive reprint in this deck is Hunted Horror, coming in at $13.30. I love Hunted Horror, not only because of its horror synergies in this deck, hitting, milling, all that stuff is great, but any card where you can be political and gain favor with friends is just a fantastic commander card in general, so I love that this is going to get cheaper. Some people don't like the idea of giving away tokens to your opponents. It's like you're giving something to your enemy. Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If I can make a friend with these tokens or make sure these tokens never get sent back at me or get a favor later on in the game, then Hunted Horror is even better than a 7/7 for 2. It's a 7/7 for 2 that got me a favor, that got extra damage in. It's fantastic. The next most valuable card is Herald's Horn, $8.21. This fits in so many different tribal decks, and so if you're in horrors, fantastic. Herald Horn is going to be great, but this is going to get cheaper for your angel decks, your elf decks, your zombie decks. Fantastic inclusion. Next up, we have a commander staple that was getting way too expensive, Lightning Greaves. Time of recording, $7.93. If you care about your commander, if you want your creatures to smash in with haste and protect them from spot removal, Lightning Greaves is the equipment for you. Next up, we have a Leyline of Anticipation coming in at $7.57. I think that these effects are very, very good. I'm not going to get into a big argument about Vidalcan Orrery right now or Leyline of Anticipation, but one thing to note is that changing the turn order, allowing you to play at instant speed and not subject your creatures to sorcery speed removal is good, especially in a deck where you're being reactive. And Gavin mentioned that this was a good fit for this deck because of the horror aspect. Like when you don't know what to expect and then boom, a horror out of nowhere is attacking you, it works with the deck and it works with the theme of the deck. I'm a big fan of this reprint. Next up, we have Curtain's Call, just a great removal spell, $7.12. This needs to be cheaper, perfect fit for this deck. We also have Nemesis of Reason, $7.10. This was a logical reprint as a powerful horror, but huge milling potential. It's great. Black Market is $6.35. This is a controlling deck, and so this deck's gonna take a long time to kill someone, and so we're gonna take advantage of all of the creature death that's going on and get tons of mana from Black Market. It's really fantastic big ramp out of black. Mindcrank at $5.40 is a perfect fit with the mill strategy of this deck. It's like matches with Captain Negathrod perfectly. Now I mentioned that there are 9 reprints between $2 and $5, coming in at $4.65. We have Talisman of Dominance. There's great ramp in this deck, and this inclusion of talismans is just phenomenal, so hats off. Next up at $4.25, we have Spellskite. Now Gavin mentioned that this was a little bit of a nombo because it has 0 power and we want our horrors to attack. But we also want Captain Negathrod to stay on the battlefield, and we just want a critical mass of horrors, and this one is so iconic, it really did belong in the deck. Next up at $4.25, we have Hullbreaker Horror. This wouldn't normally see a reprint because it's still in standard, but it clearly belonged in the horror deck. Next up, we have Memory Plunder at $3.61. I love this reprint. I did a YouTube short about how much I loved Memory Plunder, and getting into more people's hands is gonna make other people fall in love with this card. Next up, we have another ramp spell, Thought Vessel at $3.58. We have a couple lands, River of Tears, $3.51, and Tainted Isle at $3.12. Next, we have 2 cards that were getting a little bit too expensive, but belong in tons of different decks. We have Pull from Tomorrow, just a really efficient draw spell at $2.33, and Drown in the Lock, counter removal, works with mill decks. This was coming in at $2.67. And that's the wrap up for these 17 cards from $2 all the way up to $13.30. So Gavin has talked to us a little bit about how this deck plays, and it plays so much fun. I've had a chance to try it out, and it is a really exciting deck because you can cheat something big into play or play the slow, methodical, horror tribal milling strategy. I love that it attacks on so many different angles, and the gameplay changes based on your opponent. Let's listen to Gavin a little bit.
I'd say the most common thing about this deck that we found in playtesting over and over again is it would start playing, it would look like, some rinky-dink horrors coming down, no one really called it a threat, and then out of nowhere, over the course of like a turn, or maybe 2 turns, it would just totally shift in its favor, right? You captain return something huge of your opponents, you play one of your big horrors, you play a huge spell like the replicate spell, and Psionic Ritual, and suddenly it's like, wow, you are in business. And then by that point, everyone's like, okay, well, let's team up and kill off the horror player. But at that point, you've drawn a bunch of cards, you have the control deck, you've got, all the action you need, and you can kind of take control of the game from there. So that's pretty fun. There were a lot of games where Captain Negathrod would attack, or, you'd attack and mill them a little bit, and then you would hit their 8 mana creature on turn, 4 off a mana rock. And those are very memorable games. So suddenly you become the arch enemy right away. And it's like, okay, well, here's this 8 mana creature. It's gonna be a big problem. So a number of those games. But overall, I think one of the cool things about this deck is, like, as I mentioned earlier, it can play out in so many different ways. There's a lot of replayability because the commander, you never know what card you're gonna get from your opponents, which leads to a bit of a variance there. And, you can draw a hand with a bunch of cheap horrors. Like, the game where you play turn 2 hunted horror is so different than the game where your first horror is Captain Negathrod on turn 5, right? And you're really gonna find the game plays out quite differently depending on the draws. So one last little touch here, kind of like the horror cherry on top of it all, is we were reprinting a ton of old horrors in this set. And I was like, what would be really cool is if we could reface some of these old horrors to have Mind Flayery themed artwork so that they really fit in the world of Baldur's Gate. Could we get some more Mind Flayers in that way? And Creative was on board. So there's 3 horrors in this deck that actually have brand new artwork that are made to look like Mind Flayers. We've got Sewer Nemesis, which was originally actually from Commander deck, so here it is back again. We've got Consuming Aberration, which is like custom made for this deck, basically. You get to mill out your opponents and gets bigger. This card will attack for a lot of damage, by the way. This card is gigantic in this deck. And then we've got Guilt Feeder coming with brand new artwork too. So 3 cards that have new artwork as well for this deck, which I think is pretty cool.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining me for this deck reveal. Thank you one more time to Gavin and the team, and Wizards of the Coast for giving me this free preview. I also want to thank my sponsor, Cool Stuff Inc. Remember to use that coupon code JUMBO5 to pick up singles, sealed product, all that good stuff. Check out Cool Stuff Inc. I also want to thank my patrons. They're amazing. They support me every day. Thank you, patrons. But most importantly, thank you. Thank you for doing all the things you do, liking, subscribing, watching these videos. It's a really awesome opportunity to dive deep into these decks, and I really like putting together content that people enjoy watching and getting the hype up, and I am hyped for this deck. Make sure to tell everyone in the comments down below how you would upgrade this deck so that we can get the best versions out there at Commander tables, into local game stores, at kitchen tables with your friends, so we can just play some more Magic and mind flay people. All right, everyone.